Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is,
Peter Crisp of Fossil Free Football.
well, Peter, thank you so much for doing this. You look like you're in a sort of small upstairs room in an apartment. Is that about right?
I'm in the converted attic space of a typical four-story Dutch mid-century row of kind of residential apartments. So it does get quite warm up in the sort of attic space of this building, especially on a warm summer's day like the one I'm talking to you on.
Nice. And sadly, you no longer have the direct presence of Daddy to protect you from Russia since Daddy's gone home. But nevertheless, NATO smiles upon you with all its beneficence.
Yeah, it's fortunate that we're not speaking a couple of days ago because we had the I don't know if it was the might of the US Air Force or a NATO helicopter that was circling incessantly above the city for hours and hours on end, which would have created quite some background noise, unfortunately. But no, we're Donald Trump has returned to North America, and some normalcy has returned to city life in the Netherlands.
After the Dutch people were fronting up a million euros a minute for the duration of this wonderful Gabfest. Anyway, that's not why we're gathered together today. And I wanted to ask you about, could be to do with today, could be to do with this week, could be to do with this year. What's currently dynamizing you, impeding you, exciting you, interesting you? What's happening?
I think the place that my mind goes to most obviously is the way in which football, which is something very, very dear to my heart, that I've been passionate about my whole life,
Mm.
as a player and as a supporter, is unfortunately being used as a tool for the combined forces of those who unfortunately don't have a positive vision for the future of our environment and our planet and everything that is living and breathing in the world today. So the fossil fuel industry has unfortunately been using football as a tool to cement and increase its power and leverage in the world. And as a football lover and a lover of our amazing shared environment and biodiversity. That is something that really, really gets to me and is never far from my mind. But I'm lucky that I'm able to um, channel that focus in my role as a campaigner at Fossil Free Football, where we're trying to ensure that football has a more positive impact rather than the negative one that it currently is having in large parts.
And I must say, as a follower of some of these issues, I'm immensely indebted to Fossil Free Football for the work that you guys do. Could you tell us a little bit about the organization?
Absolutely. Fossil Free Football was launched by my colleague and our founding director, who is a former Dutch civil servant, diplomat, public employee, but like so many of us, also a committed football fan,
Hmm.
and someone who wanted to sort of make a positive impact in the world, and yeah, like so many people, he wanted to join the public service to fulfill that positive impact, and did so for a number of years in that role, but then realized that actually he could perhaps join the good fight from outside a government role by taking on the world of football and trying to change the world of football to be a better, positive environmental actor. So it was founded by him after he took a period of time away from his job, unpaid, to explore the possibility of beginning this organization, and realized that the broader kind of climate movement, what we call the fossil free movement, that was working to um, further the goals of decarbonization and reduce the power of the fossil fuel industry in many parts of society. It had its attention on areas like the financial sector or the advertising sector or the arts and culture, and trying to encourage museums and galleries to break from the fossil fuel industry. But there was no such organization for such a big sphere of cultural influence in the world as sport and as football within sport. So he noticed that gap in the market, to coin a phrase, and decided to step into that and try and encourage football to do better by the environment on which it absolutely depends. And so he was able to do that work unpaid for some time, and then was able to secure some funding to grow the organization and have more impact, and was able to establish a kind of a voice of authority on matters of environment and sustainability and football, by kind of by reaching players and fans who care about the issue and don't like the way that football has been going, and was able to kind of grow a media profile and a presence on social media, via reaching all the people out there who are football fans and who don't like the way that football is being used by the fossil fuel industry. So there was kind of an audience there who were receptive to the ideas of the organization, and the organization was able to develop a little bit more, and then bring myself on to join our founder Frank, and expand our work even more. And now we're continuing to attract even more volunteers and fans from around the world who share our goals and motivations, and that's a really nice movement to be part of.
Now, next Northern Summer, pardon me, as of course you're aware, the Men's World Cup finals are on in three of the biggest countries in the world, Canada, Mexico, and the United States. Here in Guadalajara, we'll be hosting some of the games. And the amount of plane travel that teams, executive hangers-on, sponsor hangers-on, media people will be making, the amount of flying they'll be doing, because all three countries, as you know, have completely impoverished mass transit systems, and specifically railway systems, is extraordinary. So is that an element of this, or is it more the question of sponsorship by the extractive sector that troubles you guys?
I think, yeah, people often ask kind of what the worst offending sector of sport is, and they like a kind of rank and a villain to go after. I think it's fair to say that both the direct impacts from all the transport and travel, of the millions of people who'll be visiting North America and traveling from around the world to North America next summer, are absolutely incalculably large. And then the sort of less obvious, slightly more subtle, although not quite that subtle anymore, influence of sponsorship pollution, what we might call advertised emissions or sponsored emissions, that are slightly further afield, but are emitted as a result of people, of the billions of people who are tuning in to watch this tournament from around the world, being inundated with advertising that is exposing them to the messages of the fossil fuel industry that are heavily pro-polluter. For example, some of the world's leading and largest airlines will be encouraging fans to book long haul travel for their next holiday when they watch the football. And then we have the world's biggest corporate polluter, Saudi Aramco, the state oil company of Saudi Arabia, which will be a major sponsor of the tournament as well. So there is some research being done to actually quantify what the emissions might be when you have literally billions of people being exposed to advertising from these huge polluting entities. And there are kind of quite interesting ways of trying to put a figure on that. But it's fair to say from our perspective, and we're not climate scientists, we're really just concerned fans who want football to do much better. That both the transport of people flying all around the world to this expanded tournament, there'll be 104 matches across North America. Will have an unbelievably large pollution footprint, and
Mm.
then it's also important to consider the messages and sponsorship that are associated with the tournament as well. And that will also be a huge footprint that we simply cannot afford in the year 2026 when we're this deep into a climate crisis that is obviously completely underpinned by the continued burning of fossil fuels.
In Mexico, four airports, two in Mexico City, one in Monterrey, one in Guadalajara, are undergoing upgrades, in inverted commas, to meet FIFA's standards, as if FIFA were the arbiter of things like safety and comfort at airports. But it seems to me one of the things about FIFA, which as most listeners will probably know, is the international governing body of football, sets itself up as a parastate. It wants, like the International Olympic Committee, to have its own sets of laws being applied to the areas where it operates. It doesn't want to be subject to national scrutiny, but certainly wants to get public subvention everywhere it goes. So, what can ordinary people do when FIFA has so much power and appears to be so complicit with this world of growth of football, growth of sponsorship, growth of air travel?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question to answer in a satisfying way. Unfortunately, we wouldn't be in this difficult position in this deep into the climate crisis and this deep into the negative role of football in that story if there was an easy solution and if there was something that I could just say to quickly empower the individual person to make a difference that would fix this mess. But with that said, there are still, international football and it is still a semblance. There is still a semblance of democracy there. And FIFA is the governing body and sits on top, but individual supporters, I suppose, they can do whatever they can to find other people who feel the same way, remembering that together and collectively we are so much stronger and more powerful than anything we could achieve by ourselves. So you could join with the other people around you who feel the same way. You can perhaps use social media to find those people. And then you can try and exert pressure on, not perhaps directly on FIFA or on the president of FIFA sitting at the very top of the tree, but perhaps on your local football club, who should be answerable to you as a supporter and a kind of a stakeholder in that local club or institution, and try and encourage them to exert pressure going up the chain, as it were, to the National Football Association, who should be able to take a somewhat of a position in relation to everything that FIFA does. They are the kind of constituents of FIFA, as undemocratic as it is. They are FIFA is still answerable to national football associations. So I think the most obvious way of people exerting any pressure on the direction of football is to try their best to find other fans who feel the same way. And we know so many football fans out there who are deeply frustrated and disappointed with the direction that football has gone in, not just in regards to the environment, but in regards to human rights and getting into bed with dictators all around the world, and with regards to this general push towards commercialization that's kind of stripped out the local identity and beauty of so much of football. So try your best to find those disgruntled and seemingly disempowered fans, and take back some power by coming together and then trying to lobby your local football association, your national body, and try and encourage them to find other football associations who might feel the same way. I think one of the things that's been frustrating when it comes to the actions of national football associations is that um, they share the attitude that so many of us feel, that FIFA is so big and powerful, and just irredeemably kind of immoral and corrupt, that they refuse to take any collective steps to try and do something. And so we need to encourage them to form coalitions of people who do care about these issues. You could easily imagine a coalition of perhaps European football associations linking arms and coming out with a strong initiatives against the direction that FIFA has gone in, or perhaps the direction the US has gone in as the host of the World Cup. And we've seen this kind of action and intervention before in 2022 with all the kind of build up to the Qatar World Cup and the concerns around human rights. We did see football associations come together and make some sort of intervention. So um, that is a very long way of saying that everyone needs to do what they can to find others and exert pressure where they can, and hopefully that will build to a wider kind of collective response.
I'm thinking also of the astonishment, certainly that I felt, and I suspect many others did too, when the Department of Justice went after FIFA and Sepp Blatter, Gianni Infantino's predecessor, and his henchmen of crooks, liars, cheats, and members of the plutocratic oligarchy of the world, and took these bastards to court. And some of them were convicted, not Mr. Blatter. Many of them lost power. That made some sort of change. And that shows you what can happen when a powerful government like the United States gets the bit between the teeth. That's certainly not going to happen over these issues with the current complexion of the US, or one imagines any other future complexion of a US government. So dedicated are those administrations to the fossil fuel economy. But it did show that FIFA was not inviolable, was not invincible, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such a good point that I think we need to remember is that sort of democracy and democratic processes of accountability will, I'm confident, although perhaps less confidence given recent events, but democratic processes of accountability will inevitably overcome those who prefer a more authoritarian model of governance in any sphere. So we've seen FIFA become almost a one-man band again, following the kind of departure of Sepp Blatter, the previous president, to sort of institute a few reforms, but then not really make sufficient reforms to prevent the emergence of another, as it were, kind of authoritarian presidential head of state figure, such that it is essentially a one-man band where Gianni Infantino is calling the shots. But those systems, I think history teaches us, are inherently fragile and changeable and just cannot necessarily persist for that long. There are literally billions of people out there who would like to see football have a more positive impact and to see sort of a sort of democratic revolution at FIFA. So I'm confident that at some stage, if we exert enough pressure, we can push the forces of accountability. Even if it's not the US government or the Department of Justice, but even the media and football fans and players and pundits, there are a lot of people who could perhaps wield their influence in a way that changes FIFA for the better. And it's up to all of us who care to try and avoid falling into the trap of just bottom of the barrel expectations for FIFA. And so often when we talk about anything to do with FIFA, people just roll their eyes and shrug their shoulders and dismiss them as corrupt and irredeemable. But we just have to, imagine a world where we expect more from FIFA, and then in that context, some of the egregious things that we've seen from the leader of FIFA, for example, being part of the US presidential entourage as it traveled around Saudi Arabia and Qatar, as they were kind of sealing dodgy fossil fuel and development deals. He was on that trip and then neglected his real job and his real obligations to actually deliver the kind of address and lead the FIFA Congress that was happening simultaneously and that he arrived late to. So if in a world where we expected better of FIFA, something like that had happened, everyone would be up in arms. But unfortunately, in this world where everyone has the lowest possible expectations of FIFA, in a moral sense or in any sense of kind of good governance and leadership, the tendency towards apathy tends to win out in some way. Not that no one had strong feelings about recent events and about the direction that FIFA has gone in. And so I would just urge there to be a kind of shift in our thinking towards FIFA. We just have to expect better than what we're currently getting, and apathy and low expectations actually only benefits them and allows them to kind of cement and strengthen their own position.
Apart from these plutocratic oligarchies, isn't there also a problem? And this is obviously a leading question, so by all means, feel free to disagree with the premise. Isn't there a problem with the fetish for growth? That football must get bigger. There must be more teams at the Club World Cup, more countries at the World Cup finals, expansion, expansion, expansion.
Absolutely. I'm not going to reject the question, but I do have I don't like to approach this kind of issue with a particularly kind of Eurocentric focus, and that is something to be aware of when we're talking about this. Um, I've for background, I'm a British Australian football fan myself who spent many years living in Australia and kind of getting a sense of what life as a football fan is like if you're from a country that is not of the kind of mainstream and the traditional elite. And so in that context, I do have sympathy for the some of the arguments that it would be nice if more countries could be part of the FIFA World Cup. Um, but unfortunately, those arguments for expansion, although often kind of coated in this veneer of expanding accessibility to football, are usually driven almost entirely by the need to make as much money as possible and kind of thinly veiled greed. So although it can perhaps be a valid sort of concern to have that it's a particularly kind of elitist and Eurocentric view that there might be a smaller version of the World Cup where fewer teams are participating. And I am open to those kind of concerns. I think when it comes to the environment, at this stage of the climate crisis, it is just totally beyond belief that we would be massively expanding the footprint and going for kind of business as usual ultimate growth of any major institution or thing in our societies. And football and the World Cup should be absolutely no different. I think it's perhaps useful for football fans as a bit of a thought experiment to think back to previous iterations of the tournament that didn't have so many participants and matches. So and I should say that FIFA have taken the decision to expand the tournament to 48 teams and playing 104 matches at the next tournament. Previously, it had only ever been 32 teams. And in eras before that, it was 24 and fewer and fewer. So if long-term football fans cast their mind back to the era when the tournament was much smaller, do we dismiss those tournaments as irrelevant or boring or uninteresting or not worthy of a place in football history because they were slightly smaller than we have today? No, we don't. Of course, they remain as iconic as ever because you're crowning the champion of the world. And starting with 48 teams and then whittling down to one is really no different when it comes to the kind of iconic status of the tournaments as having a smaller tournament that eventually crowns the world champion. So there is absolutely a strong case to be made that for the good of the world that we live in, there's really no reason why football tournaments in general, and it's not just the World Cup, it's almost all football tournaments need to be massively expanded. And I would make the case very strongly that we could still have an amazing world of football competitions that were smaller, reduced in the number of matches and participants, and actually regionalized. And it's really interesting to consider how you might regionalize, for example, European-wide competitions, perhaps even learning a little bit from US sport, dividing them into different geographic zones, to minimize the kind of the vast amounts of travel that would be used or needed for that tournament. And then perhaps you could play off between different zone winners to crown the continental winner or something like that. So there's no need for football fans to be afraid that any calls for a kind of slightly smaller tournaments need to be something that they run away from. I think actually, if we collectively put our heads together, we could come up with a pretty impressive alternate format that is more in keeping with the late stage of the climate crisis that we feel ourselves that we know ourselves to be in. But unfortunately, the push for endless growth in football, as in just about everything, is unfortunately winning out to this point. And that's how you end up with the crazy expansion that we've seen across tournaments. And I should also point out that players and the people who are actually putting their body on the line and their welfare on the line are strongly opposed to this expansion. It's absolutely not just environmental campaigners or football fans who care about the environment who are opposed to this expansion. Very many people in the football world, players and managers and commentators, are concerned that injuries are going through the roof as players are being pushed and pushed and pushed beyond their limits. And there's a very strong parallel between a planet that is overstretched and pushed beyond its limits to players who are overstretched and pushed beyond their limits, and sending us clear messages that we need to reverse course.
Yes, we speak during the World Club Championship, another FIFA vanity event, and games are being held up because of intense heat, because of dramatic electric storms, and so on. Plus, FIFPro, the International Players Union, is looking to restrict the amount of time that players are expected to be on the field as it expands, and of course expands in terms of travel. But one element here, Peter, is that in the last few seasons in the English Premier League, Manchester United flew to Leicester to play. Arsenal flew to Norwich to play. Teams are flying domestically all the time. In France, Paris Saint-Germain flies everywhere with Qatar Airlines. They are its creature. And so there are these short-haul problems which expend a hell of a lot of gas. And of course, frequently with these elite planes, small, short, hot planes, they travel at least in one direction completely empty. Nobody's in them. This is a big issue to be dealt with in addition to the headline stories about the millions of tons of jet fuel used by people traveling to watch tournaments, right?
Absolutely. And this is probably an area where we can make quite a simple demand as well. It's not a particularly difficult thing to fix. Our organization, Fossil Free Football, joined with some partners last season to track all of these flights that were going on in the English context. And we were able to kind of keep an eye on what teams were doing as they took these very short haul flights across the country. And it's quite shocking, some of the decisions that they do make. It really gives you an insight into this bizarre parallel universe that they inhabit, which unfortunately is the universe that we all share, where some of us are, using paper straws rather than plastic, and carefully washing out our aluminium cans to do our little bit for the planet, or ensuring that we minimize the flying that we're doing. But unfortunately, these actions that we make as individuals are set aside. These teams who are just behaving in the most environmentally damaging way by choosing to fly very, very short distances for next to no good reason. I think from memory, the shortest flight that our team identified this season was 24 minutes, and 24 to kind of 35-minute flights were seen almost every weekend of the Premier League season as teams travel comparatively short distances for audiences beyond Europe um, to play football matches. I think this issue is perhaps not that well understood by the average football fan. I personally didn't quite realize that teams do this all the time. To be clear, they always travel the day before the match begins. So in a world where they didn't get on a private jet, but chose their incredibly nice luxury coach instead, for example, or took the train like so many of us do, and like their fans do when they go to watch them play. In that world, these players, even in the instance of a sort of incident that might close a road or force the cancellation of a train, they still are traveling the day before. So there's absolutely no good reason why they can't travel by road or rail like the rest of us and like their fans do. And this is an area where, as I said, there's a pretty clear demand and there's quite a clear obvious alternative. Sometimes when it comes to the issues of the climate crisis, people are concerned that there's not an obvious alternative, and they don't know what the kind of best answer is. But in this area, it's crystal clear that there's absolutely no need for teams to be flying very short distances to play Premier League matches, and they absolutely could be getting the train or the coach instead. And I don't think they would see any particular kind of backlash or sort of problem with doing that. It has to be said that a reason why a lot of the teams choose to fly these short distances is that they have the next game just 3 or 4 days later. And so we see kind of overlap between the issues of the football calendar being
Mm,
expanded and expanded and expanded, where
mm,
players are being squeezed and forced to play every 3 or 4 days. Actually, if we lighten that load and revise that so there were fewer matches, it would be better for sustainability in terms of the kind of the direct pollution of those matches. But it would also perhaps enable teams and fans to avoid flying and travel in more sustainable ways. So that's an important consideration as well. But yeah, there's no need for teams to be doing this. It's absolutely widespread. We actually realized that it's happening far beyond the Premier League. So even in the lower, poorer leagues of English football, there are teams who are still taking private jets or chartered flights to matches, which I found pretty remarkable. There was actually quite an interesting story this season where Wrexham, which is the team that is owned by the kind of Ryan Reynolds and these Hollywood celebrities, which has an unbelievably good kind of PR arm and PR department, and has managed to win a kind of global fan base with their kind of success in the last few years and their compelling online presence and their documentary. That team is generally seen as a little bit of a fairy tale or a team that people can get behind because they're not owned by Saudi dictatorship or something like that. But even that team was happily flying to their matches, even when it was only a very short distance, and they were playing in the third division of English football. And so, yeah, that just illustrates the point that it's an issue that goes far beyond the top of the football pyramid, and that's actually concerningly widespread. And yeah, when there's good alternatives available by road or rail in 2025, there's just no reason why we're not taking those obvious cleaner, less polluting alternatives.
Yes, I'm fortunate that I read at least bits of your report that were published that were excellent. The BBC's also done some good work on this historically in terms of this sort of ridiculous travel. Let me shift direction for a moment, if I may, Peter, to ask you about the strategies that you guys employ to get the message out, but also to receive feedback. What, for example, has been your experience of so-called social media versus the bourgeois media? I mean, you guys normally get reported by The Guardian, for example, which is going to be sympathetic to the message. What happens with, Springer titles in Germany and elsewhere? Or what happens with the Telegraph, the Daily Mail, these sorts of publications?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. You might be surprised at how reticent some of the perhaps more liberal or sort of progressive leading media are to these kind of concerns. One challenge that we have at Fossil Free Football is that we are desperate to expand the coalition of people who care about climate change, and that means we're desperate to sort of to reach football fans and ordinary supporters, but who perhaps have sort of abstract concerns about climate change, but but were unaware about the impacts that it's having on football. So that means we're talking to sports journalists. We're not necessarily talking to people who are entirely familiar with environmental issues and used to covering these kind of issues. And so when you're talking to sports journalists who are used to kind of writing football match reports, not delving into kind of issues of decarbonization and fossil fuel petrostate geopolitics. There is a sort of a slightly they're on a slightly uneven and unfamiliar on terrain. So there is a little bit more kind of convincing and persuasion that needs to happen, even with people who work at organizations that more broadly are more aware of the climate emergency. When it comes to outlets who are less interested in covering climate change and perhaps more open to the arguments of the fossil fuel industry, shall we say, um, that's touching on a sort of base premise of our organization is that I think people sort of perceive the climate movement and the people who are pushing for climate justice and taking climate change seriously. There is a sort of an accusation and a perception that those people are often slightly better off, slightly have had the benefit of had the privilege of spending more time in higher education, and are slightly kind of closeted and insular, and often kind of shouting down from a position of some privilege. And so fossil free football is really trying to break out of that bubble and reach people in ways
Mm.
that touch issues of what they really care about and come to football, which is something that brings people together and which is such an important thing to so many of us. So we're working really hard to break out of that kind of bubble, which means we are really hoping to engage with media who don't cover climate change every day. And there are ways of kind of doing that when it comes to football, by touching on some of the hypocrisy involved. So and you have to be a bit careful when you do this, but for example, with stories about millionaire footballers taking private jets and stories that kind of reflect an inherent privilege and talk about the kind of ridiculous money involved in football, um, and then some of the greenwashing that goes on. So some of the same football clubs that have these kind of quite environmentally conscious, PR conscious campaigns around the environment are also the same ones who are still happily promoting deeply polluting and harmful sponsors. So the most environmentally conscious club, many people would say, in the Premier League is Tottenham. but they still have an arm of BP as their sponsor. They still have was sponsored by Ineos, who make fossil fuel powered cars. And so when you get these instances of kind of obvious greenwashing and kind of hypocrisy, where clubs are saying pro-environment messages on the one hand, and then doing something else on the other hand, I think there is a kind of media demographic out there who are kind of receptive to those messages of greenwashing and hypocrisy. Of course, some of them might not have the same motivations that we do in kind of in kind of targeting that hypocrisy and that greenwashing. But I do think that it's still important to try and uncover those instances, because the worst thing that we can have is a situation where the average person sees this kind of greenwashing, and they think, if those people aren't doing the right thing, then why should I? Or they just want them to kind of stop talking about the environment in general because they're not fulfilling that message in their actions. So I think it's still really important to take our message as far as it can possibly go. We do sometimes have to adapt it a little bit for different media outlets, but in general, I think there's such a wide awareness of the issues going on with football, and to be honest, the issues with climate change, that no media outlets can, be particularly. They would have to be ignoring huge sort of swathes of their readership to totally ignore these issues. And even if they do prefer to do that, I think most outlets realize that the average person actually does care quite a lot about the future of our environment and what kind of legacy they're leaving to their grandchildren. And so you can't run away from these issues, no matter who you are.
No, but the data really show that, despite the rhetoric of reactionary politicians, corporations, and journalists. So I had two more questions for you, if I may, Peter. And after that, I'd just like to open things up as a way of concluding by offering you the opportunity to add anything you might wish. And that anything could be something new that we haven't touched on, or it might be revisiting a topic we've engaged with. Does that sound okay as a means of bringing things to a conclusion?
Yes, certainly does.
So the first of my last two questions is this. In so-called activism in general, and perhaps most poignantly in environmental activism, there's a big debate about so-called non-violent direct action versus trying to influence public opinion through arguments, ideas, so on. A reformist approach to public policy versus a revolutionary one. We've seen Greenpeace, for example, seek to disrupt the final of the Champions League about 10 years ago because Gazprom was a sponsor, not because of football's direct environmental impact. Where does your organization stand on that notion of, in a sense, interrupting people's daily lives to smash a point at them?
Yeah, what an interesting question, and something that I could happily listen to. Other more experienced environmental campaigners reflect on. What is rational in the year 2025 when we're this deep into this crisis? Is it rational to keep trying the same old tactics that haven't worked before, or is it rational to pursue direct action and take more kind of directly intervene with what's going on? Um, I, I, I can say on the behalf of fossil-free football that, given that that these issues are perhaps slightly newer in football, and we are coming from a place of love for the game and love for the sport. So we don't necessarily think that directly attempting to kind of shut down the pollution associated with football is a goal that is going to get us to where we need to be. But part of that comes from the fact that we are football fans, and we are really concerned about the idea that sport would just have to be shut down to prevent the pollution that is associated with it. We have seen some people come out and talk about fans not being able to go to matches, fans not being able to travel to matches. And as a football fan, I find those ideas really difficult to stomach, especially when ordinary people are paying the price for the actions that are in large part not really driven by them as individuals, but are driven by the kind of 1% of the biggest polluters and the super wealthy, who are not necessarily affected by those actions in quite the same way. So at this moment, we are continuing to fight the fight of in the kind of in the realm of public opinion, pursuing more old school kind of informative campaigning through the traditional media. Um, but we are also trying to be a little bit more innovative when it comes to social media, and getting the word out as much as we can. But do I blame or sort of harshly criticize people who take direct action to shut down the pollution associated with football? At this stage in the climate crisis, I fear that actually we may not go down in history, that we may kind of reflect on this period of history in the future and wish that we had been more directly interventionist. I just don't know. At this stage, I do hold on to some hope that we can pursue more conventional measures to change football. But I am not completely convinced of that opinion. And sometimes I do waver in that kind of in kind of coming down on that side of the argument. But as a football fan and a football lover, I don't want to see, my motivations are that more people today and in the future get to enjoy and experience the love of football. And that is what is at risk from the climate crisis. Football, and especially local and grassroots football, just does not do well in a world with much more extreme heat and much more flooding, and much more incredible storm activity. And trying to prevent that loss of the love of football and everything that football gives us is what we are completely motivated by. So it would be slightly backwards to then intervene in football in ways that shuts it down. And then, that does bring about a sense of loss of the people who are losing out today. You might say that we need to sort of have much less today to have more in the future. And that's just part of the ethical and kind of philosophical intricacies of this kind of work. But we are motivated by love for the game, and we want to see football thriving into the future. And we just hope that our campaigning is going to get strong enough to make that change and bring about the change that we want to see. And we hope that we're not too late in that work.
Well, you've actually touched there en passant on my last question, Peter, which is abolitionism. I can see a means of recuperating domestic football, the Champions League, and the Euros by imposing regimes whereby travel must be by train, particularly when there are networks of fast trains in much of Europe. I cannot see how the World Cup could be recuperated.
Yeah, I um I am not particularly optimistic that there is a path that the World Cup can quickly shift to, that can make it compatible with the science on the targets, around where we need to be in terms of the climate crisis. Unfortunately, we're at the stage when any massively polluting event is doing harm in some way, by contributing to climate breakdown. And yeah, it's right to touch on the ways that some forms of football can be actually shifted in quite easy and obvious ways, to something that is compatible with a livable future. But events on a global scale are much more challenging. I would make the case that we can still shift to a smaller World Cup, with perhaps half as many teams, that goes some way into making the event much more sustainable. But I certainly also share those doubts about an event that is on such a big stage ever fitting into a sort of climate positive future. But it's again a tricky kind of ethical and philosophical point because what do we lose if we abolish football tournaments? We lose so much. And how do we set aside the kind of the joy and belonging and community and identity that football gives us with the environmental degradation and harm and the impact that that has on future generations. So it is a really difficult thing. There is no clear answer on the sort of overall quantifiable positive versus negative trade-off between reducing football today to sort of hold on to football in the future. I certainly don't have a clear a clear answer on that one. Fossil-free football is not campaigning to abolish football or sort of end football as we know it. But we are making the case that football needs to get much more serious about the risk that it's actually facing from climate crisis. Unfortunately, there are ways in which we could shift to a more appropriate version of some of these tournaments with appropriate travel and sponsors. As you mentioned, when it comes to the World Cup, it's much more challenging. But if we collectively take this issue seriously and kind of channel the billions of brains around the world who love football and are motivated by holding on to a future for football, perhaps we can come up with a way of doing that. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is so far away from that scenario that at the moment it's more fruitful for us to just try and reduce the crazy impact that football has overall, rather than spending all our time trying to consider how we might get to a kind of utopian, really positive future. Unfortunately, at the moment, our goals are slightly more limited than that. But it is certainly a really interesting conversation to have. At the end of the day, I personally think that the football that means the most to people is hyper local, and it's the football that they go and play with their friends at their local club, or watch their kids play some under 10s game in the rain in their local park, or going to watch their non-league team play in a small stadium surrounded by people that they know and love really well. So to be honest, so much of the conversation around elite football, we speak of it as if we're speaking about football in general, and that's just not the case. It's actually local football and grassroots football that I think brings the vast majority of the kind of beauty and joy of football in the world. And that should definitely not be lost in the conversation. So, yeah, I could be open to arguments that talk about cutting out the kind of, millionaire elite football in favor of safeguarding football at the local level. But at the moment, it's also important for us to, remain in the kind of realm of realism and think realistically about where we are and where we can get to, given the current regime in charge of global football and given the state of global football and the evolution that it's gone towards in the last few years.
And finally, is there, as I mentioned earlier, something you'd like to add to our conversation? Either something that we haven't discussed, or perhaps revisiting something we have?
Yeah, I suppose I'd just give one example that is, I think, really powerful when it comes to speaking about some of the issues around sponsorship in football.
Mm-hmm.
So fossil-free football is campaigning for sponsors that are more ethical and environmentally aligned. And unfortunately, so much of the sponsorship that we see in football is trying to push us as football fans towards unethical, antisocial, heavily polluting decisions, such as traveling across the world for your next holiday, or buying that big, heavily polluting SUV. Sorry. And we need to see a different kind of regime of sponsorship in football. But when we mention those kind of issues of sponsorship and branding, people have concerns about what might come next, and what a different kind of model might look like, or they don't perhaps buy the idea that changing the world of sponsorship and the world of advertising is realistic or that relevant. So, but I encourage people, just as a kind of a useful kind of parable almost, is to just think about what sports used to be like decades ago, generations ago, when everywhere you looked in sport, you would see advertising that was pushing a heavily antisocial and unethical and harmful and unhealthy practice onto people, and that was choosing to smoke and lining the pockets of big tobacco. Those advertisements used to be absolutely everywhere in sports, pushing people towards something that scientists and doctors were telling us was unhealthy and antisocial. And eventually, a kind of movement grew that decided not to accept that any longer and decided that it was inappropriate for sport, something that is associated with health and and positivity and vitality, to also be associated with smoking and tobacco, and eventually clubs and leagues and associations and players and fans just didn't want to do that anymore, and they didn't want to be part of that. And of course, there was regulation that eventually kicked big tobacco out of football. And so, if you think about the current fossil fuel regime and the way that the sponsorship that we're seeing in football is constantly inundating us with pro fossil fuel messaging, and then you think about that in the context of a world not so long ago, not so different from our own, when another kind of antisocial and unethical and harmful practice was being pushed through sport. We did come together and we did kick it out of our sport, and we're better off for it. And so, reflecting on the evolution from a football that pushed smoking onto kids, that now pushes pollution onto kids, I think is quite a useful and inspirational kind of positive tale, that does show us the power that sport has to bring about positive change. And that's the kind of change that fossil-free football are pushing for.
Well, Peter, Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today, and a note of great appreciation for the work that fossil-free football does.
My absolute pleasure. Thanks for a really nice conversation.